Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Syrian, Jaziran and Iraqi warfare from, say, the mid-11th to the mid-14th century. This is just an introductory video for such a wide area and time, as you understand, but it's still useful for grafting on it some further and more in-depth one. I resumed the older cycle, so we will also be seeing more medieval warfare in the next days. So, giving a look at the map, as always, is a good habit to understand the culture, the territory we're talking about. So, we're looking to make the long story short at the medieval Fertile Crescent. Right. So there you have these three regions from west to east: Syria, the Jazira, and Iraq. Now, medieval Iraq doesn't correspond to the boundaries of the modern country, as fundamentally the Jazira includes most of what is today northern Iraq. Right. So by Iraq we will essentially indicate the central and southern low-lying parts of the modern country. Right. The Jazira also included essentially the less mountainous parts of southeastern Turkey and northeastern Syria, while medieval Syria herself ran from Aleppo and Antakya, that would be the old Antioch. Further south, there are different ways of indicating this extent. Some sources think of Syria like basically the entire Levant, except the Anatolian peninsula, right? So straight up to the Gulf of Aqaba, the one from which Reynald of Chatillon launched raids into Egypt from the Red Sea coast. This space, it's a strip of land that politically at the time would still be considered separated, however, from the coastal regions of the Mediterranean that were held by the Christian Crusaders. It's a bit of a perverse way of seeing it. You can't say that, yeah, it was canonically Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, etc. But this is also a way of looking at it. And this land, as we'll see now, was also run by different rulers at this point with different influences from different countries. Now, some of which were also part of the previously mentioned lands. As you understand, it's also a diverse area to describe. So we will focus mostly on the differences, right? And so what we can characterize on the base of such characteristics. So historically, if you look at the Fertile Crescent as a whole, some include in it even Egypt, telling the truth, but the space here had been governed by the Caliphate or Caliphates, if you want. There had been the Umayyads, then the Abbasids, so this had occupied respectively Syria and Mesopotamia as at least centers of power. So the others were dependencies and in theory at least were controlled directly, but from capitals laying elsewhere. Plus you have Egypt and say this Syrian space that at a point was heavily influenced by African dynasties such as the Fatimids. All right, so Egypt tended to protrude towards the north historically, and there would be some important joinings from the other area. Think about the Ayyubids, the takeover, and other similar mechanisms later with the Mamluks. The Caliphate had prospered between the 7th to the mid-10th century, right? Which had conferred to the region an unprecedented stability, right? Historically, at least in medieval times, which begin admittedly with the same Islamic conquests in this region. However, the the previous picture was characterized by the Persians from one side and the Romans from the other. So historically, the middle ground was a bit messy, right? It had not witnessed to the development of a major regional power. At this point, the caliphates have instead held substantial power to stabilize regions that are fundamentally prosperous, relatively prosperous. They're densely populated, right? So the political stability would make the rest. When we look at the end of today's video's period, we realize instead that things change once again, a bit like in the previous pattern, when the Mongols arrive, right? Because Baghdad is razed to the ground. The let's say a Mediterranean power, namely the Mamluks, control the western side of this broader region, while the Ilkhans are fundamentally a Mongol dynasty, but ruling over a Persian state. So on the longer run, what you see there with changing dynasties, the Ottomans, the Safavids, you have basically coming back to the previous Byzantine, Sasanian contrast, let's say. And so a destabilized area in between this essentially Iranian and Roman Empire in the mid, with also significant religious divide. From the west you have the Sunnis, in the east you have the Shia, but these are more or less the boundaries that we set. Remember that the Mongol conquest of Iran and the destruction of Baghdad, the latter specifically, are the major turning point in Islamic history, right? The destruction of Baghdad was one of the greatest tragedies in the history of mankind, and the Mesopotamia never really recovered from this. On the contrary, you have now two powers of war against each other, and this becomes a new battleground, right? With all the destabilization that also favored even later on the Western takeover, all the problems that this era was somehow recovering in spite of the dictatorships. But to an extent, they got what they deserved, and so what a mess the region still is fundamentally. So it's one of the single most war-torn areas in the world historically for this aforementioned dynamics. Now, the aforementioned division between the Mamluk and Mongol or post-Mongol states ran through the Jazira, right? So the swamps basically in the central part, in the central part of the Fertile Crescent, which we have documented, especially in that video I made about the Wafidiyya, that is to say those essentially political exiles, sort of refugees from places like mostly the Ilkhanate, but even as far as the Golden Horde, that decided to defect to the Mamluks at some point, where there was all a series of vectors there, including the fact that many Mamluks came themselves from the Caucasus, from even beyond it. So the instability of the Islamic world historically is connected with interesting political and religious considerations, namely the fact that Islam doesn't have a priesthood, right? And so that all the forces are concentrated basically in the sole leadership, right? There is a spiritual guidance, but it's not really distinguished from the actual earthly powers that also have normally a sort of negative, say, perception among the general population as a sort of God's usurpation. It's very, very different from the concerted effort of temporal and spiritual power in Christianity. We have seen recently in the series about Eurasian steppes warfare how, of course, and we will see it better now, this constant waves of nomads had definitely not helped the the Near East to consolidate more stable regimes to some degree, because really stemming these people's cost a lot, and generally speaking, the land was overrun by their military, right, to a degree. Think about the Gulams, the Mamluks, that refounded their own same system, right, naturally in a sanitary fashion, but still fueled by continuous imports of nomads. So it's a completely different picture from most of what we've seen, namely in Europe, in other sanitary areas. During this video's period, let's say, we witness a decline also of southern Palestine and the bulk of modern Jordan, which even predates the Mongol invasions. And much of this had to do with the aforementioned instability of the Abbasids, of the Fatimids, at least their apparent carelessness or impossibility to intervene across the stripe that was connecting them with Syria, which was a big deal for the Muslims to recognize in these rulers the God's chosen one, right? And obviously having these two chunks of power, one located in Syria and one in Egypt, with the Crusaders in between, doesn't matter how successfully fighting against the latter. Think about, Saladin, the battle of Hattin, the reconquest of Jerusalem, were still precariously connected, right? They were complicated to control. We're talking about very, very large spaces, by the way, quite composite ones, and again, suffering most of this dichotomy of power installation by the side of powerful dynasties, but the presence of local communities that, as we will see, maintained, in spite of all this Turco-Mongol coming and going, their own previous, Arab traditions from a military point of view as well, which are very fascinating to observe. So it's also a struggle in a very broader sense between the nomads and the sanitaries to a degree. The Bedouins, so the semi-nomadic populations of the Arabian hinterland, were also active in this period. They participated in the armies of these major powers that they had always been doing, right? The same Islamic conquests fundamentally are just the next step of an Arab participation to the Roman Persian struggle. And some of these influences are to be found in quite primitive features of arms and armor here in otherwise very advanced militaries, such as the ones of the Abbasids and so on, because you can notice that this likely came from the Bedouin hinterland. It was, again, that backwards, but also quite warlike, right? So what works is the good enough in between very often. Now, the final blow to this southwestern part of the crescent seem to have fallen during the Crusader era, for obvious reasons, because the area became, again, a large frontier. It was a relatively unpredictable system. The Kingdom of Jerusalem actually had a hell of a potential, which is never stressed when looking at the general future of the Crusaders' enterprise, which is considered like doomed since the beginning, or this utter BS. It wasn't at all, right? Both sides were good, right? And war in many ways is unpredictable, so things can happen independently from preordered, allegedly, predetermined condition. Nevertheless, again, the local region doesn't benefit particularly from the Frankish invasion and all that followed, even within the same political bounds of the Islamic world, outside of it. Let's pass to look at this variations, right? So what really stands out in terms of arms and armor, warfare generally meant tactics, strategies, and so on, right? So, in spite again of the sense of a universal power embodied by the caliphate, the Fertile Crescent had somehow always been war-torn and politically confused in some ways. Right now, we do not have the time to digress on the before, right? But the even in the Islamic Golden Age, the difficulties of the caliphs to control this entire regions, right, unitarily, even just the Abbasids, Mesopotamia, right, were quite complicated. During the second half of the 10th century, the Buwayhids of Western Iran ruled Iraq and the southern part of the Jazira, while the Fatimids maintained their hold on southern Syria. The Buwayhids, I think we described them recently, I don't remember in which video, but let's say at least they had a mixed type of warfare that was already including the nomadic ghulams, right? So an increase in cavalry power, especially as they had risen to regional power. But the bulk of their ethnic forces had been somehow more sedentary. Right? They belong to the previous phase. In fact, from the 7th to the 10th century of Islamic warfare, where you have a lot of infantry. Right, cavalry has not yet taken over concretely, right? The infantry probably here were even more important than in the West in relative terms. We will be listing some sources here to explain archaeologically or just iconographically or documentary what we're talking about. But a Buwayhid warrior from different portraits would essentially be equipped with, say, aside from the characteristic large turban, small round bucklers, who would wield a non-tapering broadsword with also relatively pronounced pommels. And such swords, especially, are very telling of the persistence of a rather Iranian tradition. You know, we've seen it very often, especially in the Eurasian steppe series, the idea that the Iranian steppes had straight, double-edged blades, right, that had probably a lot to do with a more evenly spread wealth per capita, the general population, so that was more armor likely around. When the Turks arrive, of course their elites are impressively armored, and especially the ghulams that start spreading here are professionals, right? So very often, yes, they bring their own styles, but they're also better armored by the same local caliphal arsenals or things like that, while the population was being demilitarized compared to prior times. But in the steppes, like, you have much lighter troops numerically, in proportion to the elite ones. So D type, instead of straight single-edged proto-sabers that would occur with the arrival of the ghulams, is really external, right? So instead the broad non-tapering double-edged sword was still, by the Buwayhid time, like normal in the Central Islamic lands, right before the spread of Central Asian influence. And there are actually lots of examples. They cannot cover them all, right? That show the persistency in this sedentary militias of the Middle and Near East of such type of older Iranian swords. Or Iranian-derived kind of swords, opologically. If you look at one of the Book of Stars from, we don't know exactly where it was made, either Iraq, Western Iran, or Egypt, right, around the 30s of the 12th century, that is preserved today at the Sulaimani Library in Constantinople. I will never call it Istanbul, but the Turkish audience will forgive me, hopefully, for that. Is telling us that after all this time, at least some of these, there are different swords represented, of course, in these sources, but one stands out for being straight, non-tapering, right? So a sword that is used for chopping, actually, and chopping, especially in a foot sense. Before we said that this is because there was more armor around, so it should have not been more chopping. Well, the sense still, however, is that the militias that were fighting against one another here, like some, we will see it, were well armored, but of course were, generally speaking, more light than say the general cavalry, at least the shock force against which even these weapons could be ideally be used. Also because the lighter types of cavalry were horse archers, right? They attacked from the distance, and they were not even meant to close in with infantry, right? So you have still swords like this throughout all the centuries. Next, two slightly curved types with also angled saber hilts with zoomorphic decorations. These are all typical Central Asian influence. And again, these straight broadswords certainly seem to have persisted in Fatimid Egypt and even the Eastern Arab areas, right? So across the entire region. Some even having the same sleeve or collar next to their quillon. That was one old characteristic. At the beginning of our period, northern Syria and the rest of the Jazira were ruled by the cultivated but warlike Arab dynasty of the Amdanids. As you know, by this point, we're in the 10th century. The Byzantine Empire is witnessing a rapid re-expansion, especially at the detriment of Islamic powers, so much so that the empire seized parts of northwestern Syria and its Mediterranean coast. Right, the Abdanids had been constituting a sort of buffer state between the Byzantines and the Caliphate. They had been useful at a point, but they were giving way to their larger neighbors, right? So that the same empire was basically going in. While during the 11th century, the region was in fact fragmenting among various other minor Arab and Kurdish dynasties. As you know, the Golden Age of Islam ends more or less in parallel with a broader process was occurring in Eurasia of revival, say of local revival to some point. Here we're talking about political unity, disgregating, but because feudal power was rising, right? It's difficult to talk about feudalism for Constantinople or for the Islamic world, but if you look at the Paranoia, the Iqta system, etc., you realize that, say, whatever these rulers were controlling their lands, it was, in a more decentralized way than before. Naturally, it wasn't just this sort of strange, deterministic trend. Lots of political and military issues were triggering this, and we will see it better now talking about the Seljuks, right? Before, just name another Arab clan, that of the Mazziadids, who took control parts of Iraq, outlasting the petty dynasties to the north, surviving against the odds, you would think, until the mid-12th century. But even in this case, again, they're basically a couple of centuries, not even, and that tells you how relatively short the life of these powers really was. Now, the Seljuks, as you know, are a big deal. They were a Central Asian Turkic dynasty that had essentially managed to install itself in Iran, where it had been heavily Persified, but still maintaining quite strong connections with the steppes world. In the late 11th century, the Seljuks succeeded in overwhelming this politically fragmented region, so that by the time of the First Crusade, they had basically and theoretically controlled the entire region, plus the new conquest of Anatolia to the north. Right, so we know the broader history of it. We mostly remember massacre, but there is all a military history taking place in these regions as well that were somehow probably the westernmost, and in this sense, a very difficult place to fight in, like with very strained supply lines. Again, most of what the Seljuks could arrive through, with the further consequence that once the empire overstretched, it began to fragment itself, right? As soon as the Seljuks established their own empire, it began to split apart, so that the Crusades themselves were actually exploiting this fragmentation rather than simply trying to stop a Seljuk conquest that had already happened, and by some degree not even changed excessively much, especially in the westernmost areas, as we will see now. As you know, the Seljuks also acted as protectors, and de facto they were the controllers of the Abbasid Caliph. They were newly zealously fanatically Orthodox Sunnis, right? The newly converted have to fit in, and so from the steppes, from paganism, and they are, as we've seen, pretty warlike, and already habituated to the business of mercenarism from centuries, even before the rise of the Seljuk dynasty themselves. But this also means that, again, they participate in that system of feudalization that splits their own same empire, right? Syria and the Western Jazira were among the first provinces to slip from the control of the Great Seljuk of Iran, right? Then you have another phase of further disgregation from the bottom, when the minor Seljuk princes were effectively, albeit not always overtly, a bit like it had happened with the Great Seljuks and the Abbasid Caliphs, ousted from, in reverse, ousted from power by their own military officers, right? So it was something, of course, no, we don't have to digress, but divine in the sense of this even seigneurial establishments. Again, this was not literally at least it was, of course, understood as a universal empire in its own regard, because at its peak, at least namely, and from a geographical point of view, was very vast, to say the least. But again, the sense of accomplishment of the even and the ambition, of course, of this latter military officers, known as atabegs, could be quite high, and could receive even the support of the population, because again, these lordships, in a way or another, had been established because the local population had accepted them. Not in a particularly different way from what you see feudalism in the West, except these were not autochthonous dynasties. Doesn't matter. In some ways, it can even be better for the locals. And you have at this point the rise of certain dynasties that would develop, in fact, within this broader Seljuk world, that still maintain the fiction of this feudal connection, and even at some point blood dynastic relations with the entire system until the 13th century. And names as very important names in the area, like the Burids of Damascus, the Zangids of Aleppo. You're looking at the entire space here: Syria, the Jaziran, parts of Iraq, and even Western Iran, right? Because Iran is also huge per se, so the Great Seljuk wouldn't be able to control the entirety of the plateau. You have other important centers, notoriously Mosul, in Sinjar, other parts of the Jazeera, right? Then you have the Artukids to control the rest of the Jazeera, by the way. The most powerful of these dynasties was the Zangid one. So much so that they absorbed some of these dynasties. Other dynasties instead survived until the Mongol conquest that really wiped out a consistent amount of them. However, in the late 12th and 13th centuries, these dynasties were subjugated by the enormous Ayyubid power that had arisen, essentially from a Turkish tribe whose leader had managed to found this dynasty and taking over a great part of the of this region, plus the western part, plus Egypt, etc. Given the Kurdish background and still the continuity in the presence of Kurdish forces in the among the Zangids, the Ayyubids, you can notice an interesting persistence of nomadic military styles, right? Even though the entire area, also the Caucasus, had historically been quite affected by these combat styles as well. There is the magnificent carved gate of Ahmadiyya in northern Iraq. Now it sadly collapsed or removed. I don't know exactly. This was the western gate of the settlement. It dates back to Zangid times, and it shows great Kurdish military influences. There are lots of similarities between the traditional styles of arms and armor in the mountainous Kurdish parts of the Fertile Crescent, but as well as with the Byzantine world, with Lesser Armenia, even the Crusader states to some degree, because as we've seen also in other videos, the Byzantines, their Frankish auxiliaries that also served the Seljuks in Anatolia, by the way, later on, and I made a video specifically on that too, were in fact more, substantially in contact with one another. Were specific local styles in the Caucasus that stand out, and they were more centuries in practice. Right, this gate was carved for the Zangid governor of Mosul, was at the time Badr al-Din Lul. The interesting aspect of some of the figures depicted here are the foot soldiers, right, with straight, not tapering broadswords. Interestingly enough, again, right, you find sashes and clothes around their chests and shoulders as a common motive of Zangid, Ayyubid, and even early Mamluk art that altogether do show, again, the reemergence or just the persistence of this more sedentary traditional substratum, different from the dominating, say, Turkic styles. Stereotypically, we've seen it very often in the video about Crusader warfare. The Turks were more mounted, right? Their armies large. They had infantry militias from these towns, but they tended to fight mostly mounted. Very powerful, but numerically contained elite of heavy cavalrymen, then swarms of horse archers all around. While the Mediterranean world, especially Egypt, right, also the Levant, showed, aside the obvious Frankish influence, a much greater Western profile on the base of the local warfare, because they were more sedentary populations. They lived in less unstable places. They were more urbanized. They had a somewhat more widespread per capita wealth. Thus, they fought with armies that the proportion of the arms which were very similar to the Frankish ones, right? But it was just like a native thing, right, pertaining to mostly the sedentary world in practice. Speaking of the Mongols, that were surely an important influence on the area during the 13th and the 14th century. Of course, I can address you mostly to my Mongol warfare playlist, because we talked really a lot about them, so it's useless to digress now on the general Mongol warfare, their influences, like locally from an iconographic archaeological point of view. What basically they get down to is lamellar armor, a lot of lamellar armor, tassets, and even a tendentially more standardized profile at some point. But this was also the merit of the Iranian armories that provided the Ilkhanate with very substantial and advanced equipment. Because telling the truth, the Mongol arms and armor were quite primitive. Obviously in the first during the first wave of the first invasion. Importantly enough, the Mongol invasions led to the fall of the Ayyubid state. That was already trying, equilibristically to remain up, and the consequence was the reversion to that sort of family federation that unified the empire. The Ayyubids continued to rule later on for an important time, but just as a minor dynasty, especially in Syria, right? Following especially the Mamluk reconquest of the area from the Mongols, interestingly enough. However, the Mamluks themselves were now hegemonic, and they would just assert themselves as they had overthrown the Ayyubid rule in Egypt in 1250, right? So thereafter, when we look at the eastern direction, like Iraq and the Jaziran, were ruled by the Ilkhans and their successors, while Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan were ruled by the Mamluk sultans of Egypt. However, especially the Jaziran and Iraq, but also some parts of Syria, were more like, we can say, not really no man's land, but some sort of still broad frontier area that, as we were saying before, was mostly suffering demographically and economically, but if anything was also fortified further, as we will see now, because during the Crusades and even before, where there had been major military engineering developments in the area, as a consequence of encapsulation of feudalization we were talking about before. So, can we look at some specific aspects of Mongol influence in the local panoply? Yeah, of course there are. We see some interesting, connections, also with other cultures. If we look at Syriac Gospels from the mid-13th century, such as the one from Mosul in northern Iraq that is preserved at the Vatican Library, is the Syrian 559, you can see mail on the neck and arms, probably indicating a shirt worn beneath a lamellar cuirass in the specific case of one soldier. The lamellar itself appears as a short cuirass covering the chest and abdomen as well, but it's also shown with short flap-like sleeves. Tassets that are also very Mongol are indicated, at least by the source, in a somewhat rudimentary way. They have to do with broader Asian influence. All right, it can, as we'll see now, there was an important Khwarezmian injection, as you know, in the 13th century, Middle and Near East, right? The armies of Jalal al-Din, right? But of course, it could be also a Mongol thing. We have then some of the finest iconographic representations in the Shahnameh epos manuscript that are very Persian, mostly, in fact, showing, characters of the Iranian epos, but with lots of Mongol influence in arms and armor. And there's really a lot of stuff, and I treated those. I made a video specifically about the Ilkhanid heavy cavalrymen, so that would be the more appropriate episode to watch for further information. We will keep talking about that as well. In any case, again, there are many. There is the Shahnameh preserved at the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, the manuscript 104. That shows what we just pointed out. Even on Mongol arms and armor, strong Iranian influence, right? Quivers, for example, are of the open-ended Middle Eastern type. Bows have angled ears. Armor is lamellar, and helmets have typically Mongol double ear protection. We find a curved dagger that is also the case of a tapering saber, curved and distinctly Middle Eastern or even broadsword next to them, which is fascinating because it shows how even Persia, that had historically had her own traditional let's say fighting style, had much in common with the same Mesopotamia historically, and had been influenced by Arabs as much as it had influence by the Arabs. We're talking essentially about the Romans and already what the Persians had done in Mesopotamia, but still that what we're talking about being injected further in the same Iran for these forms to survive further later. We have the Shahnameh of the Freer Gallery, the number 30 at Washington, D.C. This shows again, mostly Mongol features with helmets with ear flaps, nomad box type quiver, a winged or fluted mace, a heavy javelin. These were especially designed to cope against metal armor, and then curved sabers, knives behind a pouch, round shield. This is all very Mongol, right? Then there is a small lamellar cuirass, apparently soft corselet with flap sleeves. There is also a sort of collar tippet, so basically extra armor was covering the neck and the shoulders and the chest, which also seems to be lamellar. This is very heavy cavalry, as you understand. And interestingly enough, this form of tippet corresponds to the male ones of early 14th century Italy. Not that there is necessarily a connection between the two, but at least it was spreading as a majorly heavy say complement for the men-at-arms protection. There is also a very interesting feature here that is a double-ended spear or javelin, which is present at least in the work of a Chinese artist representing Central Asian Turks. So in that case, we're talking about a large bladed weapon. Here, there may be some parallels. There is, for example, an early 15th century manuscript illustration, the so-called Fatih albums, that may represent the same thing, but it's very isolated, scanty evidence. And we do not know exactly what stuff this is, so it's possible that these weapons were used, right, were wielded with both hands, right, cutting and thrusting, rather than being used to the same crochet techniques that you see in medieval Europe and in part also in the Middle East. Of course, everybody could do really everything with these weapons normally and fighting the most diverse things. But the sense is that either there is a sort of Hellenistic influence, like this stuff looked like an older system that should have mirrored the cavalry of Alexander the Great at some point, so mimicking it at least in this noble Mongol Iranian context, or we're really looking at some real type of heavy and by some degree also archaic type of warfare that had characterized mostly the late Iranian steppe rather than the Turkic one, but that given the heaviness of the knights involved here may have had something to do with that. The greater stability with the stirrup compared to the time this needed before. We don't know at the time of the Sakas even how they managed to hold the bridles. We think there was also a system of straps, right, for those who used the compass rather this barge pole basically that they used to smash against one another, right? The epic background of this of the Shahnameh so could make us think of a poetic license of some sort. Then we have another Shahnameh from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This is the Fund Rogers 6974 at New York. This came possibly from all these Shahnamehs here we mentioned because they may have been from Iraq rather than Iran. They date all, say, around 1300 or the early 14th century, so we are in the right time frame, and this one shows at a point a scene in which Rustam has taken off his helmet while washing his horse Raksh. Now the helmet is lying on the ground, and it displays an eyeless, beardless face or head, right? That according to the artist's intentions, was probably meant to depict an anthropomorphic visor. Now, what is fascinating about this is that, as we've seen the videos about Pechenek warfare, numerous such visors have been found essentially in the nomadic areas of southeastern Ukraine, for example, also in Constantinople. So it wouldn't be strange by that point. This is not, admittedly, these type of helmets become famous because of the Pecheneks, but after the Mongol conquest, right? So the idea here is there were already lots of slaves. Think about the Mamluks drawn from those same lands north of the Caucasus, whatever. Wouldn't it have been common, right, to actually, with all this movement of troops from the same areas, to have normally, right, this style also in the Middle East, right? And the connection with the steppes is, interestingly enough, supported also by another find that is a war axe found in Syria, dating to the 13th century, now preserved at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. The inventory is M145 1919. It's a very beautiful war axe inlaid with silver. Generally considered to be a parade weapon, but you can never really tell the difference, especially when it's so evidently, usable. Let's put it in this way. And very similarly decorated axes are found among the Volga Bulgars, about the warfare of whom I made a video, by the way, and may have somehow had a connection, in fact, even with the Near East, as far as troops, exports, whatever, were concerned. Again, the Mamluks came from a very wide area, right? It was just slaves traded in the steppes, and again, there's nothing surprising even about this find. So, making a step back in time, because we talked about the Mongols now and we got them out of the way, but there are some other interesting connections with the steppes, still with, especially the western ones, right? In fact, the use of warriors drawn from outside this region, and especially from the fact the western steppes, had been dating to forever, right? You can't really tell when it first started. We mostly associated it started consistently, I mean, with the caliphate, with the gulams as such, but there is a rich history also through Persia and the Sasanian controlled Mesopotamia, likely of similar dynamics. The Scythians had been raiding the Middle East millennia before Christ, so it's really a long journey. However, there is a non-necessarily just warlike element next to all these cavalrymen that are at least military engineers, and this would have come together with horsemen still and other warriors from the areas of Khorasan and Transoxana, who had been sent especially to bolster the Dar al-Islam's frontier with Constantinople during the 10th century. That was a pretty mountainous area with lots of bulky fortifications, and as you know, Transoxana, Khorasan, etc. were the home of some of the greatest scientists. There was really an astonishing concentration in the history of Islam, right? They came from these territories at the frontier with between the steppes and, in fact, the Central world, to Baghdad to make great fortune, and because these were towns that had been born on the steppe, on the Silk Road, right, surrounded by steppe, accumulating a lot of wealth, and so combining with this modern and traditional world and becoming more genial, if you prefer. And this Khorasanian and Transoxanian military engineers were so prized that their descendants in northern Syria and the Jazira, as well as newcomers from the same area still at the time, were still recorded as both siege engineers and cavalry in the 12th century. Here we're before the Great Raid, also of Constantinople by the Khwarezmians in the 13th century, after the Mongols had kicked them out of their abodes, right? So we're talking about long-term connections between, probably the Near East and these places, almost in Central Asia. However, it's impossible to observe this region without concentrating on properly on the most typical professional military men of the time, that is, the Turkic Gulam, right? They said to have been infesting the area as unemployed mercenaries from the 10th century on, right? Probably they were around from quite a while, right? And surely they had, as we were saying before, been already hired, like Warda Turks, right? Surely also the Huns were, being employed by the Sasanians. There was this mutually, let's say, this osmotic relation. Surely Heraclius' troops at Nineveh had been meeting with these proto-Gulams and Warda Gulams in this regard just technically slaves, but just like the Mamluks, you don't have to think just of the passive import, right? These people would willingly become slaves at a point because of the privileged status of professional soldiers they would acquire at the service of caliphs. This is true, however, also about the Khwarezmians. They served from the same, in the same way, right, or from a consistent while, and the Khwarezmians were some of the finest horsemen around. They had some of the most ancestrally traditional connections to the what we know as the Navba, the sense of the golden drum, right, that had to be brought by a war chariot, just like the hero, and being acclaimed by other drums played by the hostages, say the princes of the subjected peoples of the Khwarezmians, to celebrate this greater transcendental music that dates back as a tradition way before Islam, right? It's a Parthian thing, right? The great drums, say, that the Romans heard as their last sound, probably at Carrhae, in many circumstances, were all part of the kind of steps, kind of nomadic necessity to organize at great distance, right, the troops to maneuver them effectively without them being signed. Think about the dust just in these places being risen when large masses of cavalrymen arrived, and they had to be heard everywhere, and it had to be that complex, right? There's a musical tradition that would remain greatly developed, more developed than in Europe, where it was in part just adopted eventually via the Ottomans. I made some videos about this. In any case, these Ghulams and Khwarezmians would serve the local rulers in this entire region. Many went on to Egypt, by the way, where there were also Ghulams from other nationalities, Nubians, places from, further west in the Maghreb and so on. While yet others played their own hands in alliance with such forces as the fundamentalist Karamita from the Arabian Peninsula on the Persian Gulf, yet another power that existed at that point in the region. The Ghulams were superior for the following reason. Like, this is a universal mechanism that happens in many other circumstances. You have more primitive, warlike, and poor people that are just leaving that constant kind of warfare, so they know how to handle it, and they can be hired in, say, that they're expensive, right? There were surely different types of troops that were hired, not just the, say, we think mostly about the heavily armored elite, but there were many types of, many lighter troops. But generally speaking, they would be hired and equipped also by the more affluent, by the caliphs, their generals, who were in control of this great arsenals in florid places, in fact, like Mesopotamia, etc., and thus would have the greatest military experience, the best equipment, and they would fight in lieu of the local militias that legitimately didn't want to go die fighting somewhere, right? And in part, it would have been better for them to maintain their own power locally, and we will talk about them in a while. But surely, on the longer run, this military service, especially in longer distance and on a permanent basis, right? Just scanned at best by seasonal contingencies, had to be mercenaries, had to be barbarians, right? People who just professionally lived as militarymen at the service of this greater of the greater powers that could rely on the militias just as a sort of support arm. The most famed Gulams were the heavy cavalrymen. We've seen how in the steppes, again, really many videos about the armed enhancement of the Turks, the need again of a shock troop that could break through, especially in combination with horse archers. Those the same nomads of the steppes are now finally finding some harder and especially in fact more static targets would at least be able to carry out their hit and run tactics. That the Arabs already did that. For that matter, there is some tactics of that type used as far as Muslim Spain, as we know, but it's the general role that lighter troops really have. Except the Gulams and the Mamluks, as these Turkic warriors, are able to do that much faster and continuously than other forces. They had made their training in the steppes, so you just hired them. You would save on all that training and just employ them regularly. Admittedly, they were at some point undisciplined, unreliable, or at least they would immediately enter the political mechanisms of the local conflicting, competing factions. But this is more a political problem, in fact, than a strictly military one. Right? They did what they had to do. Right? The Caliphate has still a formidable army on its own, made of consistent, let's say professional forces at least. So the Gulams were not the entire Islamic forces just per se. So there was a balance even between the various clans. These peoples came from the most different places. We say the steppes, but it's a universe on its own. So there would be a conflictuality between them as well, and also the possibility of being redeemed from their servile condition by being rewarded eventually with riches that in the steppes these people could just imagine, just having a sanitary life, land, say farms, etc. was a huge deal in a fertile land, right? Not in a miserable place like the steppes. So that was their motivation. But you needed constantly to ensure that these guys, once settled down, sedentarized, wouldn't be like a thorn in the side that could rebel constantly. So you would inject more of them in the system. That's how especially the Mamluks worked, but it had been going on in this region for quite a while. Surely the Gulams or Mamluks formed the backbone not only of the Seljuk armies later on, but also the smaller Atabeg forces. As we observed that substratum of local militias had weakened by this point, the feudalism that had kicked in corresponded to the collapse of public authority that had been embodied by the Caliphate, that now had basically exhausted itself, had run out of its historical moral forces. As a consequence, the idea again that there would be, and especially in these regions, not just some permanent force, de facto permanent forces maintained, this is a nucleus, as a body of heavier cavalrymen by the local Atabegs, but also lots of horse archers coming literally from Central Asia at the moment, right? Knowing that the Seljuks were, I say, one of these principalities, Mosul, Aleppo, whatever, would be moving like in the range of thousands of kilometers. People would know that and would like to go to these regions to participate, to the loot, to whatever. Of course, most of the forces came from the surrounding and some neighboring region. at most, but still the capacity of attracting, even in this war, don't think it was a major centralization. Yes, in the central places, normally you have the cities with a citadel, with walls, everything, but say, already if you move into the Caucasus or Iran, it's all much more feudal, kind of wilder and less, let's say, immediately frameable in a sort of politically and territorially stable power, so that you would always have these war bands roaming around. The Ghulams also played a considerable role under Salah ad-Din and the Ayyubids, eventually rising to such prominence that, as we remember already before, they took over the state and established their own Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and Syria. They would be able, notoriously, to stop the Mongol invasion of Egypt at the Battle of Ain Jalut in Palestine. So, really a military might that we described in several videos, and that today we will just partly address, because at least we want to show now the continuity also with the previous times in a way. But again, I made plenty of Mamluk warfare videos, so you will probably see this in the top fixed comment, and then I inserted here with all the references. There was also a middle ground, let's say, between the heavily and the lightly armed Gulag, right? The sense of the steppes horsemen, and why they were so praised, is that the average one could fight both as a horse archer and in close combat with spear, sword, and mace, right? So, admittedly, probably even the influence of Persia and Mesopotamia and more sanitary places than the steppes that had existed on these troops had already transformed them from the ways they historically fought in Central Asia, right? But the outlook was pretty wild, right? They could perform both tasks because they were habituated to everything. Then it would be mostly also the discipline received further in this lens of millenary civilization that would help framing them and others on this more permanent, again, process of, again, import and supplement and military service accordingly. Comparable Mamluks or perhaps free Turkic mercenaries also served naturally the last Abbasid caliphs of Baghdad. So this power, as just confined like within itself, still used mercenaries even when it was de facto under the Seljuk protection, using them mostly, but also having officially forces on the road. Free Turkic troops, so are more actually Turkoman tribal warriors, appeared in this region following mostly the conquest of the area by the Seljuks, right? They were particularly numerous in the region of Aleppo. They arrived en masse with the Seljuks, right, together with lots of other peoples mixed. Even though they had been existing in substantial groups, but say more restrained, more located, as long as the caliphate was functional. Here it was just not literally a free-for-all, but again, the level of privatization of power allowed them to just arrive, like it's to a sort of a far west, except it was a more civilized place from their own far east. After serving the Zangids, the Ghulams are again recorded under the Ayyubids, both as regulars on full pay and as auxiliaries. The difference being, I pay the professional troops to remain like a sort of retinues locally, and the others are just people I can summon politically to say, wanna come raid, join the plunder, whatever. Turkmens later served the same Mamluks in the same way, as the Mamluks became a dynasty that had, so with many of them had already been gentrified enough in Egypt and so on. So keeping, these troops to come from everywhere, as even Mongols came to serve the Mamluks at some point. Except they would do so now as tribal auxiliaries. So some forces were recognized to be still operating autonomously from the somehow rigidly codified process of becoming a Mamluk in the homonymous sultanate. Like the Mongols, the Turkomans still made use of the lasso in war, as well as employing Central Asian style horse archery tactics, which is again normal, not much changed in the steps regarding the essentials, really. Now, the interesting aspect of these forces, we're saying before, is that especially in Seljuk times, they had been still under some sort of control exercised by at least the great Seljuks. This is true also for the authorities that ruled after the Mongol invasions, the end of the Seljuk Empire, albeit there a bit of crisis was also kicking in, as we've observed in the area, so their control was more difficult, but also the movement was less frequent, especially because as far as the Mongol Empire remained compact, the Khans had some control on at least the major movements that had been occurring within Inner Asia, right? However, you find among the Gulams some interesting fighting styles. For example, using crossbows from horseback. Right now, this actually is nothing strange. In Western Europe, there was plenty of mounted crossbowmen already by the 12th century. The crossbow had actually always been around. I mean, even the Picts in the far north of Britain used crossbows in early medieval times. Say the Romans in the late Empire had been reviving a bit this weapon. It was something I also made a video on the very origins of the Gastrofetus in the Atlantic world, right? So it's nothing strange, except naturally in the steppes this weapon was actually known as well. It's not being dogmatic about this either, right? Just it was not so present as we start finding it there in the Middle East, right? In the steppes, it's mostly composite bows in the simple form that are used. One of the reasons why they would be trained with these weapons is that they would use probably greater impact force against more courageous infantries like the ones they could find in Mesopotamia, in Syria, in the Jaziran. Let's remember that again, the sedentaries are always the stronger, right? These Gulams are now also professional troops, so they are, aside from their their ethnic specialties, let's say, are also framed under a some sort of discipline of authority that tells them what to do, that re-elaborates their capacities, implements some others, adapts them to circumstances. Another tactic was to approach the foe as rapidly as possible, discharging the arrows from as close as possible, so exploiting maybe before stopping like properly all the abbrevium, right, and retiring to reload as fast as possible. The so-called Parthian shot was, generally speaking, there. In such circumstances, one could imagine that single-shot crossbow bolts delivered from close range by a body of disciplined horsemen being very shocking, right, and ineffective. So the role of more heavily armored cavalry that is present also with, compared to the steppes, say at least in greater numbers proportionally, was also to protect the withdrawing horse archers from enemy pursuit to some degree, because light cavalry doesn't fight in a battle line. They're in open order, so they can say flow even into the gaps between the units of heavier cavalry, because they do not have to maintain any cohesion for doing what they do. And of course, they wouldn't have a chance if those friendly heavies were enemies, right? So that's the entire point why they are called light in the first place. So again, an adaptation to the particular circumstances of the Middle and the Near East that evidently had posed a substantial challenge even to these mounted forces in the first place. Some of these gulams, we know in Seljuk times, were trained to do this against enemy battlements, allowing eventually the men-at-arms to dismount and storming the fortresses. So it required an enormous training, as a matter of fact, and this required also a capacity that an empire merely based on the steppes didn't quite just have immediately. You had to pass through, again, the Persified rule of the Seljuk Turks, the establishment of a permanent territorial de facto sedentary power, and so you can proceed with this kind of greater concentration of resources for making these armies that effective as they could be. There is also, as we were saying before, a Bedouin influence in the region. The Arabs of the semi-desert zones kept to be hired, not in a different way from the Gulams, as a matter of fact. So we can observe some very archaic features in the military equipment of these peoples. We have bronze spearheads dating to the 12th to 13th century. We think they are Arab because it's not as written on it, right? You can't really tell that this is preserved at the Islamic Museum of Mazar in Jordan. And it's usually attributed to the Ayyubid period. The Ayyubids naturally not likely making use of such primitive weapons. Yes, they were. I mean, the 12th century, they're not. We would be shocked by the level of primitiveness of the Middle Ages in that regard. But bronze spearheads definitely pertain to a backward, poor, and somehow isolated people. Surely in the Middle East there may have been some, scattered in some valley, in some semi-desertic area, but the various Arab Bedouin tribes seem like the most likely owners of this arms. From the Makmat manuscript from Iraq, dating to the 30s of the 13th century, preserved at the Oriental Institute of the Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg, the manuscript S23, which I also used abundantly here among the pictures, shows 4 Arab lances sticking out from behind of a Bedouin tent. What is fascinating is that they have a substantial blade, right, fit to a long bamboo haft, right? This is typically Arab. The guard of the governor of Marv is also dressed as an Arab warrior, having his long straight sword, typically influenced also from earlier Iranian-influenced traditions, slung from baldric. So the Arabia, yes, there was a spread of sabers, things like that, but it was also a very archaic place where the original equipment remained, where also infantry had still a substantial power to the relative terms of at least those tribal political powers by scale. What instead is more fascinating about the sedentary dimension of this region are properly the militias of the Syrian, Jaziran, and Iraqi cities. We don't think often of them during the Crusade era, but they played probably a much more important role than it's usually attributed to it. Here I will not digress on the issue of, say, comparing the level of activity and militarization to the European communal forces. That's a bit of another story. Surely we do not see in the Middle East the same degree of political cohesion, military effectiveness, and general social development that occurs in mostly in Italy. But some authors wanted to stress at least the technical connection, especially with the further the development in Europe as a whole of certain specific arms, armor, and so on. Now, this is a very important topic. I have my idea on it. I think that Europe actually was already by itself much more advanced than we think, and that, of course, we have to look at which Europe, because it's not exactly everywhere in the same way, and it's obvious that, for example, the Italian maritime republics were much closer to the Near East way before the Crusades, just because of their traffics and so on, but this doesn't tell us necessarily, whether it was surely a double threat influence, if anything, but it's mostly developed from the fact that more or less war was fought in the same way, so more or less the same things would be developed, right? It was just a matter of, which degree of political and social difference this would be declined, but I have my philosophy on it. We will talk about it on another occasion. Here we have, however, to appreciate the development of these militias. The most important element was known as the Ahdath, that are frequently mentioned, especially between the 10th and the 12th century. So, following a bit like this earlier timeline, say, of the Islamic Golden Age, in the 10th century, we don't hear much of very strong infantries in Europe, at least, in urban forces, even though they did exist. But we don't hear much of them during the 13th to the 14th century, where instead in Europe they were at their peak, and surely far beyond what had been the case for Islam, right, at this point, or any other place in the world for that matter, in comparison back in the day. So the exact status, duties, and loyalties of the Ahdath are still debated historiographically, because, as you can imagine, the Middle and Near East were quite complex. Even just think about the religious differences that were much greater than the ones within Europe. The greater proximity, again, of a nomadic military culture, so something more destabilizing, as we've seen also as far as properly a city power, like a free autonomous community in the first place was concerned. The centralistic policy of the Caliphate had also made the centers look more similar to the Byzantine ones, that perhaps were even less thriving in an autonomous sense, because Constantinople in that case had swallowed literally everything. But as we were mentioning before, the difficulties of the Abbasids, for example, to control all the centers far away, surely favored some level of decentralization and of autonomy. Egypt was also significantly urbanized. Today we do not cover it, but we will do it on another occasion. In any case, the institution of the Ahdath was similar to the Fertile Crescent. So, as as all militias, these troops functioned mostly in the defense of the city. There were not, surely there were some professional elements even among them, but they were not meant to be systematically employed, especially considering that the communities paid already a lot for the gulams themselves, that were exactly what they were heading towards, as a kind of getting militarized and more passive for, because from one side they are tired, they do not want to serve abroad, they don't want to risk their lives. From the other, these Seljuk rulers are not exactly the epitome of a sort of communal culture, let's put it this way. But it does seem that the Akhdat was highly motivated naturally in the defense of their own cities, particularly the Syrian ones against the Byzantines and the Crusader attacks in the 11th and the 12th centuries, understandably. Their siege skills, their craftsmanships, of course, these were markets. Primarily, they had shops, they had technicians, etc., were often good enough to have them summoned for offensive operations against the same Crusader castles. So you see a bit the same towns of Transoxiana had played a similar role. Well, these centers were, there was a literate dimension, there was a scientific, technological interest, and so on. These were substantially developed areas. So the cities would be a bit the place where the pinnacle of the intelligentsia would reside, right? For example, in the early 13th century, the Akhdat of Baghdad, that of course was the largest city around, may even have made use of such sophisticated weapons as ballistas, some sort of torsion catapults, basically, but we cannot rely entirely on the terminology, which is very Sibylline, because it can mean lots of things at the same time. The same goes for Western sources. Sometimes you don't understand whether we're talking about large crossbows, like manned crossbows, or literal catapults in that occasion. But that would be already a very specific way of calling the type of weapon in the first place. You have something more generic in Latin, something like machina, etc. As we were saying before, the Akhdat seems to have declined in the 13th or 14th century, right? And it may have merged or become known as the Agnat instead, which was a sort of more sparsely organized semi-professional force on a sort of provincial basis. So this may reflect naturally the sort of further seigniorialization and dynastization of the city centers, so the gradual weakening of free forms or autonomous forms of association, and so a sort of an elite that was levied also, yes, of course, for the needs of protecting the community, the territory, but also because of the functionality of the local leadership that was mostly serving itself of still professional troops, right? So in the 13th, 14th centuries, of course, also the city's decline before the Black Death gives this further stroke. But again, the Mongol invasion, Baghdad is razed to the ground alone. These other centers really suffer a lot. So it's really a massive, a traumatic event that in the Islamic sources is really the end of the world, right? The Crusades were nothing in comparison of the Mongol conquest in Islamic historiography, aside when people today just want to choose to emphasize for ridiculous contemporary reasons. Another distinctive characteristic of the regional warfare is the level of development of its polyrcetics, its military engineering, to core. The western half of the region, and in particular northwestern Syria and the northern Jaziran, was strongly fortified, even before the Crusades. As we've seen, there had been a Byzantine frontier there. So historically, many fortresses and probably just even the local settlement had developed to be more functional to coping against the Byzantines. These frontiers were also populated by mostly in the hinterland, say in the more mountainous areas, by some religious dissidents that were fleeing from the caliphate, disagreeing with the Orthodox, the Sunni Orthodoxy, as more warlike sort of cannon fodder, let's say trebuchet fodder. We want to update. Well, there were cannons at the end of the period as well, but here we're talking about early on, like on the 9th, the 10th centuries. So even well before the Franks arrived, there was a formamentus that favored, together with the local organization, a sort of Islamic defense. Various cities had powerful citadels, as well as simple curtain walls. The citadel of Damascus, for example, that is still famous, already existed by the 11th century. Right, the present huge fortress is a slightly later construction, but it substantially dates to this time. During the 12th century, as it was happening a bit everywhere, admittedly, the advancements in siege and counter-siege artillery led to a significant development of the art of fortification, we can say, including the city walls, but also the citadels, isolated castles, right? The territory was dotted by all this. There were several fortresses that we can't even just dig or know precisely where they were located. But this were the Middle Ages, and they were functional to a broader strategy, not just offensively, but also offensively. Wall towers up to our period had been essentially platforms for archery, right? Or at most for large framed mounted crossbows. During these centuries, instead, you have the development of both the citadels and the artilleries. The counterweight trebuchet goes in parallel with the establishment of prominent wall towers serving as platforms for the same trebuchet or mangonels. We'll see the difference now. Right, the trebuchet seems, but we're not sure here. I don't even believe it, frankly, to have been invented, let's say, in the Eastern Mediterranean in the 12th century. It may have been developed in Europe in parallel at the same time. There is no real or definitive proof that there was just a mutation that Europe had just to learn from this. No, right? This stuff would have been developed anyway, given all the mounting and massive political and social development that required larger armies, larger fortresses, and consequently also the means, just the technologies to serve that the resulting strategy and tactics. Unlike the large teams needed to serve earlier man-powered mangonels, which were really pulled through muscular force, as you know, trebuchets needed only a small but highly trained crew to operate them. The Arabs were really advanced in these technologies. They had sent to China their own engineers by this point. Also, such a great civilization like the Far Eastern one needed this technicians to provide with the best counterweight artillery at this point. Of course, it made videos about trebuchet warfare, how it's all a matter of also business, who organized the building of these machines, for what would pay them, who was hired, and how. In any case, the broader implications in the local warfare have yet to be studied. Right? How, for example, the the act that participated in this mechanism, Wu was in fact really building these fortresses with Wu's money, basically, and at Similia. In any case, as you know, the Crusades saw the employment from both sides of massive engines that really are reflecting essentially an homogeneity in technological development. The military role of non-urban indigenous inhabitants is unclear. Surely they participated to the general levy, right? We do not know, however, with which frequency, what were just like their personal conditions in detail, right, in every place, and so on, right? We know of a tradition that I discussed also in the video about the Armenians of Cilicia, that is the presence of infantry archers that would remain also historically for a long time, like they're still witnessed in the 17th century, from places like Syria, Palestine, and Lebanon. The mountains of the latter region were especially good for guerrilla ambushes and so on. These guys would be hired naturally by the same crusaders. There is also the Turkopol tradition that, however, also belongs a bit to the one of the Gulams in perspective. We surely know that there were portual cities in Syria providing with crews, with ships, right? Probably not in dramatic numbers, because it was really the Italians at that point that dominated the sea, and this ports didn't have really, just as cities, the capacity to compete with even just the forces that could be put together by greater lords, right? But surely the latter were served by local ship yards, ship masters, and they had to man the crews and so on. So surely a maritime, a naval military culture surely existed in these places as well, just was minor. We also have the new substantial amount of news of Frankish troops being hired by the same Islamic forces as renegades or mercenaries. This became a thing after especially the capture of Jerusalem by Saladin. I made a video about the siege of Acre, right, in the late 13th century, but here we have knowledge, at least since the late 12th, of a substantial amount of either prisoners of war or even professional soldiers, mercenaries of some kind, serving in the same Saladin's army. We of course know of the Ilkhanate hiring Frankish crossbowmen, Italian marines employed in the Persian Gulf, like this kind of stuff. And I also made a video about the Franks serving in Seljuk armies in Anatolia, because we have possibly even some iconographic proof, at least of a very strong Western influence on the local arms and armor. And say the Normans, the Frankish mercenaries, had always been present from, you can argue, since the Viking era in the region. Actually could be hired, and they kept coming during and after the Crusades, right, for the local rulers to hire them. And it would make a lot of sense. At some point, of course, there is the problem of the religious clash per se, but again, it was full of Muslims in the Crusader armies, so it's not really a thing. I explained it countless times. What makes us a bit more perplexed is that at some point 10,000 such renegades in Islamic service are claimed to have existed in 1223. This source may be a bit exaggerated, because such numbers were relatively difficult to find even for single crusader states. Let's say it's really a bit difficult. Perhaps the source is referring to people who had just inhabited in the crusader states and that had been part of the previous military system, and so now were serving Saladin. So the situation is complex. We should look at it another time, but 10,000 seems really too much. In any case, considerable numbers of these adventurers or prisoners of war were surely present among the Islamic forces, and they also influenced the local warfare to come. Not just as such, right? Of course, places like Egypt, Syria were very connected with the West. Even after the Crusades, the Italians remained there trading as they had been doing before the Crusades. I made some videos recently talking about the influence of Western arms and armor as far as Crimea, and even the Golden Horde. So there wouldn't be anything strange here to see some substantial and mutual influence, as we'll see now, between the Levant especially and some of the greatest centers of arms and armor production in Western Europe, with all the consequences. If we look at an enameled glass flask from late Ayyubid Syria, dated to the 50s, the 60s of the 13th century, so just a couple of decades after that source was talking about the 10,000 Western renegades of some sort. This flask is preserved at the British Museum. It's the number 69-1 to 20.3. And there are, in fact, various figures here. But first of all, we find things like couche spears, for example, that, again, it's not just per se a Western influence, but at least it is found in presence of other ones. Most importantly, we have some crossbowmen on horseback, right? And here it's difficult to talk specifically about Western influence per se. We have seen that the Ghulams had been using this tactic in the region for quite a while. The point, though, is that we know that also in the West, the crossbow was used as a side weapon for mounted knights, right? This is just not showed much in art, right? And would be often dismissed as an artistic license, but there would be a lot to say about this, telling the truth, right? Mounted crossbowmen existed, right? These are also, some of these figures are lighter troops, so it wouldn't be anything strange. But here we find surely a connection with the aforementioned reference to shock cavalry tactics being properly connected with carried out throughout the alternation of heavy and missile fire. We see this in the Islamic world from 13th century Syria, from early 14th century Andalus. These are actually the only regions in which we have clear illustrations of mounted crossbowmen. Admittedly, there are not many as well. My idea is that this was part of a probably much more normal way of fighting, even in the West, than we think, and that these lands would show it more frequently just because they were more habituated to mounted archery than in Europe, where every knight knew how to use a bow or a crossbow from horseback, if anything, because they did the same thing while hunting. In fact, this kind of picture here seemingly depicts some hunters rather than warriors. But the idea is that there may have been some further consolidation just in the West of heavier cavalry And here you just have it represented, and in Europe, really not, right? Because if you're more habituated to mounted archers, you do not see this guy on horseback as a sort of using a missile weapon as a sort of unchivalric thing, because just the ethnic background is much more mixed. There are these guys coming from the steppes. This is a completely different thing. Just Egypt, let's remember it, the Mamluks, Syria, or Egypt are, generally speaking, heavier than the Mesopotamia, the Ilkhanate, Persian influence areas, right? We find an inlaid brass ewer from either Mamluk, Syria, or Egypt, where in the mid-late 13th century this is preserved at the Civic Museum of Bologna, Italy. And the guardsmen represented use swords with substantial keyon, and in one case very clearly large round pommels, right, that are indicative also, that of say more complex handling of the swords. That by the last decade of the 13th century in Europe you have double-handed swords, not just 1.5 ones anymore. And these Mamluk swords look pretty damn Western, right? They may easily be captured European weapons, or both ones, which definitely indicates a strong Western influence of some sort, right? The rest of the panoply includes, right, a short-hafted axes, possibly light tabarjin saddle axe that were widely used by Middle Eastern ghulams from at least the 9th century. By the way, don't think that next to the ghulams there weren't heavy cavalries, right? From the locals, right? This was always there, right? Even the militia, the city militias, had heavy cavalrymen for sure. This was not the thing. That we're looking mostly at things by scale of quantity and quality as well. But even the quality, don't be fooled by that, right? A guy that that can afford a complete heavy cavalry panoply is a guy that has lands, even if he lives in the city, right? So he can train equally and has a military lifestyle and so on. So it's very difficult to draw a boundary there, right? And combat techniques are learned over very hard training. There is not just a step for doing that, but it's still important to look at the melange here. We have an inlaid bronze basin by Al-Daki. This is a Ubid, probably Syria, is preserved at the Louvre Museum. In inventory it's number 5991. And two distinct forms of straight sword are shown, which may be both of Western influence or a permanence of some sort of, again, local Arab but de facto Iranian tradition. One type is double-edged with blunt tips, and the other is single-edged, possibly a sort of proto-saber, right? By the way, this is dated to 1238, 1240, right? There are also spearheads, really normally, at least in type. The dagger is a broad taper thrusting weapon, which at the time was starting to become a thing, especially considering the amount of lamellar that the Mongols spread further in the area. Shields are round bucklers, and a larger type with a prominent boss, right? But again, the Ayyubids seem to maintain a more distinctly native profile compared to the lands dominated by the Ilkhanates at that point. There are the zodiac figures on an inlaid brass writing box dating from the early 13th century, found in Mosul, north of Iraq. These are preserved at the British Museum. Frank's bequest. And interestingly enough, the coif of the warriors appears to be an integral part of the hauberk, which is also a European thing. Again, the same technology was available locally, surely could be fabricated, but it's not normally present like in Europe, right? So there are other characteristics, but I mean, just pointing out the ones that seemingly have to do some European connection. There is an inlaid bronze candlestick base by Haji Ismail that dates to the mid-13th century, coming from Syria or Iraq. This is preserved at the Museum of Islamic Art in Cairo, inventory 15121. And interestingly enough, there is an axe of almost European so-called bearded form. Again, this may be just like we can say, oh my god, there is a European connection there. Just know that they made similar weapons. And that this corresponds also to the needs of breaking more armor, right? Which requires this kind of heavier, massive things to mostly damage the armor joints right away. Also the plates are held together, etc. Because now this type of heavy armor is requiring ever greater effort, of course, to break. A privileged source for assessing the Western influence, or at least the general awareness of Western arms and armor styles in the Levant, are the Syriac Gospels, right? That, of course, inspired themselves mostly to a Byzantine tradition, but at this point, especially in the 13th century after the Fourth Crusade, are heavily influenced by Frankish presence that was just, there still with the Crusader states in the Levant, and so that shows more what kind of proximity exists to some details, right? To some kind of just to the appearance of the local troops that are here, local heroes, but evidently influenced by Western arms and armor. There's a Syriac Gospel, probably from Mosul in northern Iraq. This is dated between 1216 1220. It's preserved at the British Library, and the illuminations show what seems to be rigid neck guards, right, that, at least in the way they're artistically rendered, look very much like 14th century European bassinets, right? Then we have another Syriac Gospel, also probably from Mosul, slightly later, dated mid-13th century. This is the Syrian manuscript 559 at the Vatican Library, displaying helmets with the typically or supposedly European form, right, with a forward angled crown, right. Then there are some fancifully shaped helmets, which may indicate, in the way they are rendered, that the caps or other forms of permanent removable covering were sometimes put over the same helmet. This fashion also predates what would become popular in 14th century Europe, and particularly in Italy. Now, these are 13th century sources, and they display something that at least will develop in similar fashion, even though they're, again, mostly drawings, right? So we do not know how much they corresponded to the local material culture, but that would appear later in some of the most advanced centers of arms and armor production in Western Europe. What does this mean? They were more advanced or whatever? Unlikely so, but still, right, to a level that was able to produce designs that would have been developed at a distance of a century here in other places, right? And these are, say, not particularly developed necessarily because Mosul is, again, a relatively, here we're not talking about Syria or Egypt, right? That were quite advanced, right? These were a bit more withdrawn areas, right? There may have been, I don't know, maybe an influence of the same Westerners. It was a double threat thing, right? But the anticipation is interesting, and one of these we find also from actually an Islamic source, the Kitab al-Aghani manuscript, coming from northern Iraq, where in 1217, this is from Zangid times, it's preserved at Constantinople at the Millet Library, the Feyzullah Effendi manuscript, 1565-1566. There are interesting features here, but one is the finger over the keons of the sword, which is added to enhance basically fencing, and this stuff would reach most of Europe much time later as well, right? We see also a tapering sword with a long grip or elongated pommel that is also a type not seen in Western Europe until very late in time. So these aspects are definitely fascinating, and they may have had maybe something to do with, I don't know, a more advanced sort of step, mounted kind of fencing. Well, it's maybe not the case because here it's not much the steps as we've seen that determine the thing, but still these are powerful advanced areas for the time, and they produced this kind of feature, which is very, very interesting. A last reference can be made to the difference between Mamluk and Mongol equipment in these two areas, western and eastern respectively, dividing the area like forever, like from there on. There is an inlaid pen case made by Ahmad al-Daki. This is essentially Mamluk Syria, 1304. The case is preserved at the Louvre Museum in Paris. So the lamellar cuirass is of the short variety, lacking sleeves or any apparent skirt, right? This may not be anything peculiar per se, right? There were different types of armor, of course, lighter, heavier, right? In this case, the armor is joined up in the back, probably with laces. I mean, it's a common design. However, the sword is also straight, right? It's not necessarily double-edged, though, which shows some hybrid forms also between the Turco-Mongol and the Iranian ones, the Arabo-Iranian ones. And these characteristics are very Mamluk, however. The soldiers of both Mamluk Syria and Ilkhanate Iraq were, from a numerical point of view, primarily horse archers, right? And by the 14th century, we noticed that with the contraction of civilization, because of the general crisis of the same, the prelude to the Black Death and so on, the traditional Middle Eastern styles of combat may have actually re-emerged next to the Turco-Mongol one, right? The Ilkhanites almost certainly favored an acutely curved saber, whereas many Mamluks clung to straighter weapons or even to double-edged broadswords that were of the very primary type that we were describing for this the beginning of the entire period. So it's not entirely clear the actual dimension by which this dynamics would occur and so on. So these are very introductive videos, but we definitely notice throughout these upheavals still the persistence of certain traditional types of arms, armor, fighting styles, tactics, and so on, that in a sense could have been even just universal to some degree, but that are concentrated evenly where you have essentially the more autochthonous force rule, right? And especially in Syria, that was mostly influenced by Egypt, etc. This is quite a bit of Western influence, and so a very different space overall from even Iraq, right? That has much greater Turco-Mongol features there, and yet you have a lot of shared stuff all over, right? So we will keep talking about these, regional warfare contexts, because I think they're very telling, very revealing, and they're somehow underappreciated as well. So I'm really glad to analyze them, and then we will keep talking about also much more in-depth things like single battles, military units, army organizations, etc. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.